year 2025 brought a silence to Everest that cut deeper than any wind. A silence that spoke only of death. Philip Santiago II was a man of 45 years, an engineer who believed preparation could conquer any mountain on this earth. He had carried enough oxygen tanks to keep a small army breathing. Yet the death zone cares nothing for what a man brings. At 26,400 feet, the air turns thin as a dying man's last breath, and the body starts shutting down. Camp 4 sat perched on that frozen ridge like a collection of coffins waiting to be filled by souls too stubborn to turn back. Inside his tent, Santiago checked every valve and every gauge, believing that numbers and calculations would keep the Reaper at bay tonight. His hands trembled not from fear, but from the cold that seeps into bones and never quite leaves, not even in death itself. The oxygen hissed through his mask like a serpent promising life, but promises mean nothing when your body has already made other plans. He tried to stand, and his legs buckled beneath him like a newborn calf taking its first steps on frozen, unforgiving ground. Outside, the wind howled with a voice older than mankind, telling stories of all the climbers who never made it back down alive. Each breath came harder than the last, like drawing water from a well that was running dry deep beneath the frozen earth below. The summit he had dreamed of reaching sat somewhere above in the darkness, close enough to taste, but forever out of his reach. His fingers fumbled with the oxygen regulator, but the cold had stolen their dexterity like a thief in the long, dark night. Santiago lay back on his sleeping bag and stared at the tent ceiling, watching his breath form clouds that would soon stop coming. There was no dramatic final moment, no last words whispered to the wind, just a body surrendering to the mountain's ancient, patient will. The tent stood silent through the night while the storm raged outside, holding its secret until morning light revealed the truth within. Philip Santiago II had come to conquer Everest, but in the end, the mountain simply waited until his heart stopped beating forever. 4 days later, on October 19th, another group pitched their tents at the balcony, 27,000 feet above the world they once knew. Daniel and Sophia worked side by side, driving anchors into ice, while Marcus watched the horizon turn an angry shade of purple and black. Tenzing, their Sherpa guide, had seen that color before in skies that promised nothing but suffering and death for those caught beneath them. The storm came faster than any of them expected, rolling over the ridge like a freight train with no intention of slowing down tonight. Wind gusts hit their camp at speeds that could knock a grown man flat, tearing at the tents like hungry wolves at fresh meat. Marcus grabbed the weather meter and watched the numbers climb higher, each reading worse than the last, telling him death was coming fast. They huddled together inside the largest tent, 4 souls pressed against each other while the mountain tried to tear their shelter apart completely. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero, cold enough to freeze exposed flesh solid in less than 60 seconds of bitter exposure outside. Sophia pressed closer to Daniel, their bodies sharing what little warmth remained while the tent fabric screamed against the relentless, howling wind outside. Then came the sound that haunts survivors forever, a tearing noise as the wind ripped through their shelter like paper in a hurricane. The tent collapsed around them, burying 4 climbers under frozen fabric while snow and ice poured in from every torn and broken seam. Marcus fought to dig himself free, clawing through the wreckage while his fingers turned white and his lungs burned from the freezing thin air. Tenzing managed to pull himself out next, but when they reached for Daniel and Sophia, neither body moved beneath the snow-covered ruins anymore. They tried everything that desperate men try when death comes calling, pumping chests and breathing into frozen lungs that would never breathe again. By the time dawn broke over the Himalayas, 2 more souls had been claimed by the mountain that never apologizes for taking what it wants. Marcus and Tenzing built a wall of snow and huddled behind it, waiting for the storm to pass while their friends lay frozen nearby. The morning light revealed a world scraped clean by wind, 2 survivors standing over 2 mounds of snow that marked fresh mountain graves forever. 5 days earlier, on May 15th, a man named Subrata Ghosh stood on top of the world with his arms raised toward the heavens. He was from India, a businessman who had spent 2 years preparing for this moment, this single photograph that would define his entire life story. The summit of Everest stretched beneath his feet, and for one brief moment, Subrata Ghosh believed he had conquered something greater than any mortal man. But mountains do not care about conquest or glory, and the descent from heaven is always more treacherous than the climb up toward it. His Sherpa guide noticed it first, the way Gok moved slower with each step, his feet dragging like they were made of solid lead weights. By the time they reached Hillary's step, something had gone terribly wrong inside Gok's skull, where the brain was starting to swell against bone. High-altitude cerebral edema is a fancy name for your brain drowning in its own fluid while you stumble toward a death you cannot outrun. Gok sat down in the snow and refused to move, his eyes staring at something far beyond the mountains that surrounded his dying body here. The Sherpa begged him to stand, pulling at his arms and shouting words that disappeared into the thin air without reaching Gok's swelling brain inside. Other climbers passed them by on the fixed ropes, each one calculating the same terrible math of survival that governs life above 8,000 meters. To stay and help meant death for both, but to leave meant abandoning a man whose soul was already slipping away into the cold white void. The Sherpa knelt beside Gok and adjusted his oxygen mask one final time, a small act of mercy before making the hardest decision of his life. He placed an extra oxygen cylinder within reach of hands that would never find the strength to use it, then turned and walked away forever. Some call it murder, others call it survival, but those who have never faced that choice have no right to judge what happens in death zones. Ghost remained on that slope as the afternoon shadows grew longer, a bright orange figure against endless white, growing smaller with each passing frozen minute. By nightfall, he was just another body on Everest, joining the hundreds who came before and the hundreds more who would surely follow after him. Meanwhile, on the Lhotse face, a climber named Jason Myers was crossing a snow bridge that looked solid enough to hold a truck without breaking. Snow bridges are the mountain's favorite trick, hiding bottomless crevasses beneath a thin crust of white that promises safe passage until the moment it breaks. Myers heard the crack before he felt the fall, a sound like a rifle shot echoing off the ice walls that surrounded him that day. The world disappeared beneath his feet, and suddenly he was tumbling through blue darkness, his body bouncing off ancient ice walls on the way down. His rope snapped tight around his harness, jerking him to a violent stop that drove the breath from his lungs and left him spinning helplessly. He hung suspended in a frozen cathedral of blue ice, walls stretching up toward a small circle of light that seemed impossibly far above his head. Below him, the crevasse dropped into darkness so complete that no light had touched its depths since the glacier first formed 10,000 years ago. Myers grabbed his rope and tried to climb, but his arms had turned to water and his lungs burned from the thin air and raw terror. Above him, voices shouted commands he could barely hear, and then a figure appeared against the light, rappelling down into the frozen abyss to save him. The rescue took 3 hours of desperate work, hauling a half-frozen man up through ice walls while the glacier groaned and shifted around them constantly. When Myers finally crawled over the lip of that crevasse, he kissed the snow like a man who had just been pulled back from hell itself. But the mountain was not done collecting souls that season, and its next victim would fall in the one place climbers believe they are finally safe. Base camp sits at 17,000 feet, low enough to breathe easy and high enough to remind you that the Himalayas still own your fragile life. Nima Dorje had worked these mountains for 30 years, guiding foreign climbers up slopes he knew better than the lines on his own weathered hands. He was coiling rope outside the mess tent when his head suddenly felt like someone had driven a railroad spike straight through his skull from behind. The rope fell from his hands as his vision blurred, and the world tilted sideways like a ship taking on water in a violent storm. Other climbers watched in horror as the veteran Sherpa collapsed onto the rocky ground, his body convulsing while blood vessels burst deep inside his brain matter. They rushed to help, pumping his chest and breathing into lungs that had climbed Everest 17 times but would never draw a breath on their own again. The helicopter came too late, its rotors beating the thin air, while doctors worked on a body that had already surrendered to the mountain's final judgment. Nima Dorje died at base camp, proving that altitude can kill you even when you think you have escaped the death zone far above your head. They built a cairn for him near the memorial stones, another name added to the mountain's long ledger of debts that can never be repaid. Butter lamps flickered in the wind while prayers rose toward peaks that had taken yet another son of the Himalayas back into their frozen embrace. But Everest is not the only mountain that feeds on human ambition, and halfway across the Karakoram, an even deadlier peak was waiting for its turn. They call K2 the Savage Mountain and in the summer of 2008, it would earn that name with a fury the world would never forget. Marco Confortola arrived at base camp with the confidence of a man who had guided clients up peaks that would make most climbers weep with fear. The Italian was all business, checking equipment with hands that had touched more summits than most people will ever see in their entire lifetime on Earth. He moved through camp like a general preparing for war, because on K2, that is exactly what climbing becomes when the mountain decides to fight back. Gerard McDonnell came from Ireland with a smile that could warm even the coldest tent and a spirit that refused to believe in impossible things at all. They called him Jesus because of his long hair and gentle ways, though he climbed with a strength that belied his easygoing, friendly nature around others. Years before, Gerard had cracked his skull on a mountain and nearly died, but he returned to climbing because some men cannot resist the call of high places. When Marco and Gerard shook hands at base camp, neither man knew that fate had already chosen different endings for each of their intertwined mountain stories. The summer of 2008 brought climbers from a dozen nations to K2, all chasing the same deadly dream of standing on the savage summit. Korean teams, Serbian expeditions, Pakistani high-altitude porters, and Europeans gathered beneath the pyramid of ice that had killed more climbers than any peak except Annapurna. They studied weather reports and argued over summit windows while K2 watched silently, patient as a predator, waiting for prey to wander too close tonight. August 1st dawned, clear and cold, the kind of day that makes climbers believe the mountain might actually let them reach the top and return alive. Dozens of headlamps flickered to life in the darkness of Camp 4, a constellation of human ambition preparing to challenge 28,250 feet of death. Marco led his team out first, ice axe swinging in rhythm with boots that had walked this dance 100 times before on other frozen peaks. Gerard followed close behind with that easy stride of his, moving through the darkness like a man taking a Sunday stroll through the Irish countryside back home. Above them loomed the Bottleneck, a narrow couloir of blue ice that funnels every climber beneath a serac the size of a 40-story building made of ice. That hanging glacier had dropped house-sized chunks of ice for centuries, and crossing beneath it was like playing Russian roulette with a fully loaded frozen revolver overhead. The Korean team reached the fixed ropes first and found them frayed and damaged, forcing everyone to wait while new lines were anchored into the treacherous blue ice. Minutes turned to hours as climbers bunched up in the death zone, burning oxygen and energy while the sun climbed higher and began warming the unstable serac above. Marco watched the ice cliff nervously, knowing that every minute of delay increased the odds of something terrible breaking loose from that frozen guillotine hanging over their heads. But summit fever is a sickness that makes men ignore warnings, and one by one, they continued upward through the Bottleneck toward glory or death awaiting them above. Gerard paused beneath the serac and looked up at tons of ice that could fall at any moment, then kept climbing because turning back was never his way. By afternoon, Marco stood on the summit of K2 with his arms raised to the sky, the second highest point on Earth beneath his crampon boots. Gerard arrived minutes later, and the two men embraced like brothers who had just survived a war that was not finished taking lives from them quite yet. They took photographs and savored the view, but experienced climbers know that reaching the summit is only half the battle against mountains that kill without warning or mercy. The descent began under a sun that had been heating the serac all day, loosening bonds of ice that had held firm for decades until this very moment. Climbers formed a line heading down through the Bottleneck, each one focused on the blue ice beneath their feet, not the frozen sword hanging above their heads. The first crack echoed across the mountain like a gunshot, freezing every climber in place as they looked up toward the source of that terrible, ominous sound. For one heartbeat, nothing moved, and then the serac exploded outward in a cascade of ice blocks that tumbled down toward the Bottleneck with unstoppable frozen fury. Climbers screamed and dove for cover that did not exist, their bodies pressed against the ice wall as tons of frozen death rained down from above them. Fixed ropes snapped like guitar strings under the impact, sending climbers tumbling into the void while others clung desperately to ice axes buried in the shattered slope. Marco felt the wind of a passing ice block and heard the screams of men he would never see alive again disappearing into the chaos surrounding him. When the avalanche finally stopped, The Bottleneck had been transformed into a killing field of scattered bodies, severed ropes, and ice debris glittering in the afternoon sun. Marco found himself alive by some miracle he could not explain. His ice axe, still buried deep in frozen blue ice that had somehow held his weight. He looked around for Gerard and saw nothing but destruction. Ropes cut and climbers missing, the route down completely erased by the serac's devastating, deadly collapse above them. Survivors clung to the mountain in scattered groups, separated by gaps where fixed lines had been severed, each one facing a night in the death zone alone. The sun began to set over the Karakoram, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that mocked the horror unfolding on K2's frozen slopes below. Marco checked his oxygen and found the gauge dropping toward empty, mathematics telling him he had maybe 6 hours of breathing before the tank ran completely dry. Somewhere above him, in the gathering darkness, Gerard was still alive, though Marco did not know it as night fell over the savage mountain claiming souls tonight. The temperature dropped to 50 below zero as stars appeared overhead, each one bearing witness to the suffering of climbers trapped in the highest frozen hell on Earth. Marco curled into a ball and tried to conserve heat, knowing that hypothermia would kill him just as surely as the fall if he let himself sleep deeply. He thought about his family back in Italy, wondered if they were sleeping peacefully while he fought to survive on a mountain that wanted him dead and buried. Gerard spent that same night moving between injured climbers, sharing his warmth and his oxygen with those too weak to help themselves survive until the morning light came. He found 3 Korean climbers tangled in a web of destroyed ropes, their bodies hanging inverted against the ice wall, still showing faint signs of life remaining within. The ropes had wrapped around them during the serac fall, trapping them in positions that would kill them slowly if someone did not cut them free very soon. Gerard began working on the tangled mess with frozen fingers, trying to free men whose names he did not know from a death he could not accept. Dawn broke over K2, revealing a mountain scarred by tragedy, bodies scattered across slopes that glittered with fresh ice debris from the serac's catastrophic, deadly collapse. Marco forced his frozen body to move as the first light touched the peaks, every joint screaming in protest against the cold that had seeped into his bones. He looked up toward where Gerard had been the night before and saw a figure in green still working on the tangled ropes that held the Korean climbers. For a long moment, Marco stood paralyzed between duty and survival, knowing that climbing back up meant risking his life for men who might already be beyond all saving. His oxygen was nearly gone, his body was shutting down, and the route below offered the only chance of living to see another sunrise beyond this frozen nightmare. Marco made a choice that would haunt him for the rest of his days, turning his back on his friend and beginning the long descent towards safety below. He told himself that Gerard was already dead, that nothing could survive a night at that altitude without shelter, that going back up would only add another corpse. Each step downward carried him further from the truth and closer to a lie he would have to live with until his final breath left his body someday. Above him, Gerard continued working on the frozen ropes, his fingers numb and clumsy, but still trying to free men who were slowly dying in their tangled prison. The sun climbed higher and began warming the serac again, fresh cracks forming in ice that had already proven how quickly it could turn from solid to deadly avalanche. Gerard heard the groaning overhead but did not stop working, choosing to risk his life for strangers because that was simply the kind of man he had always been. Marco reached safer ground below the Bottleneck and collapsed onto his knees, gasping the thin air while guilt and relief fought for control of his exhausted, frozen soul. He looked back up at the mountain one final time, searching for any sign of Gerard, but saw only ice and rock and the indifferent blue sky above. The descent to Camp 4 took hours that felt like years, each step a battle against a body that wanted nothing more than to lie down and quit. When Marco finally stumbled into the tents, other survivors rushed to help him, wrapping him in blankets and pressing hot drinks into his trembling, frostbitten, blackened hands. They asked about Gerard, and Marco shook his head slowly, telling them the Irishman had died in the serac fall, that he had seen it happen with his own eyes. The lie came easily to a man who had already made the harder choice of leaving his friend behind on a mountain that was still claiming lives above them. But mountains keep secrets only until someone with a camera looks closely enough, and the truth about Gerard McDonnell would not stay buried beneath the ice for long. A photographer from another expedition had been shooting the Bottleneck when the serac collapsed, capturing images that would later tell a very different story than Marco's convenient lies. In one photograph, time-stamped hours after Marco claimed Gerard had died, a figure in a green suit could be clearly seen still moving on the upper slopes above. Gerard had survived the night in the serac fall, and he had spent his final hours trying to save the lives of climbers he had never even met before. When that photograph surfaced weeks later, it spread through the mountaineering world like wildfire, burning away the story Marco had carefully constructed to protect his shattered reputation from truth. Witnesses came forward with accounts that contradicted everything Marco had said. Pakistani porters who had seen Gerard working on those ropes long after sunrise that terrible fatal morning. The questions began slowly at first, polite inquiries from journalists who sensed something was not right about the official story of what happened up on K2 that day. Then came the accusations, sharp and pointed like ice axes driven into stone, demanding to know why Marco had left his friend behind to die alone on the mountain. Marco retreated from public view while investigators pieced together a timeline that painted a portrait of heroism and abandonment separated by only a few hundred feet of frozen slope. Gerard had known the serac could fall again at any moment, had heard it groaning above him while he worked, yet he stayed to help complete strangers anyway. He managed to partially free at least one of the Korean climbers before the mountain decided it had waited long enough to finish what it had started the day before. The second serac collapse came without warning, tons of ice breaking loose and sweeping down through the Bottleneck, burying everything and everyone in its path beneath frozen white death. Gerard McDonnell vanished beneath that avalanche, his body entombed in ice alongside the climbers he had been trying to save when the mountain finally claimed his generous, heroic soul. They never recovered his remains, leaving him forever frozen on K2, a permanent resident of the savage mountain that he had loved enough to die upon willingly. Marco faced a press conference weeks later, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions while photographs of Gerard alive after the first collapse glowed on screens behind his sweating head. He stammered through explanations that convinced no one, his hands gripping the table edge while the weight of public judgment pressed down upon his shoulders like falling ice. The mountaineering community split into factions, some defending Marco as a survivor who made impossible choices, others condemning him as a coward who abandoned his friend to die alone. Experts analyzed the photographs and witness statements, reconstructing Gerard's final hours with the precision of detectives solving a crime that the mountain itself had tried to hide forever. The evidence showed a man who chose sacrifice over survival, who stayed in the death zone to help strangers while his partner descended towards safety in a lifetime of questions. In Ireland, Gerard's hometown held a memorial service beneath gray skies that wept rain upon mourners who had gathered to honor a hero who had never come home again. His family accepted condolences with dignity while privately wrestling with questions about why their son and brother had been left alone to face the mountain's final, fatal judgment. Candles flickered around, photographs of Gerard's smiling face, that same smile that had warmed cold tents and lifted spirits on expeditions across the highest peaks in all the world. They remembered him not as a victim, but as a man who died the same way he lived, helping others without counting the cost to himself until there was nothing left. Back at K2, climbers built a memorial cairn and carved his name into stone, adding Gerard McDonnell to the mountain's long roster of souls claimed by the savage peak. Marco returned to the mountains eventually, but the whispers followed him like shadows. Other climbers keeping their distance from a man whose reputation had been buried beneath that serac. He never spoke publicly about Gerard again, carrying whatever truth he knew locked away in a heart that had learned to live with secrets too heavy to share. Years passed, and new climbers came to K2 with fresh ambitions, stepping over the graves of those who came before while chasing the same deadly summit dreams above. They touched Gerard's memorial stone before starting their ascent, paying respect to a man whose sacrifice reminds them that mountains test more than just physical strength and technical climbing skill. The Bottleneck still funnels climbers beneath that serac, which has been rebuilt by decades of snowfall into another frozen guillotine waiting patiently for its next opportunity to fall again. Some say Gerard's spirit still walks those slopes on stormy nights, a figure in green checking on climbers who've gotten themselves into trouble they cannot escape without outside help. The truth about what happened in August 2008 remains scattered across K2 like bones beneath the snow, pieces of a puzzle that may never be fully assembled. Mountains do not judge the choices men make in their shadows. They simply wait with patience, older than mankind, for the next souls brave or foolish enough to climb.